For Aslan Media, this is Reza Aslan. It's Friday, August 20th. Well, unless you've been living under a rock, you've been following the controversy over the so-called mosque at Ground Zero, which is neither a mosque nor at Ground Zero. This is a multi-faith Islamic community center with Jews and Christians on its board of advisors, being built 2 very long blocks away from Ground Zero. And for those of you who are not New Yorkers, then you don't really know how long a New York block truly is. Now, there have been a lot of arguments made both pro and against this community center, arguments about religious freedoms and liberties versus arguments about sensitivities towards the victims of 9/11. The truth is that this is far more than just about this one particular location and this one particular community center. Indeed, the same people who are behind the protests over the Islamic Community Center in Lower Manhattan, an organization called Stop the Islamization of America, are also building protests for mosques being built in places like Tennessee, Wyoming, here in Southern California where I live. And what it really brings up is this much larger issue about the growing Islamophobia that we're seeing in the United States. Indeed, this weekend, Time magazine will issue a report, a front cover report called "Is America Islamophobic?" Now, the polls show clearly that anti-Islam sentiment is on the rise. In fact, anti-Islam sentiment in the United States is higher today than it was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. But there were some questions that Time magazine asked respondents that I think really just made a lot of people shake their heads. First of all, they said, do you think that Islam is more likely than other faiths to encourage violence? Some 46% of Americans said yes. They asked, would you favor or oppose a mosque in your neighborhood? About 34% said that they would oppose it. Most interestingly, they asked whether they believed that President Obama is a Muslim. 1/4 of Americans, that's about a 15% jump from the days in which he was running for president, said yes, they believe that President Obama is a Muslim. Now, we can chalk up this, that, it's just part about the marginalized groups of Americans who have always thought that Islam was the enemy. And that's partly true. But something more disturbing is happening here as well, and that is that this Islamophobia that was ever present amongst the margins in the United States is becoming increasingly mainstream. In fact, when you have the GOP presidential frontrunner, Newt Gingrich, painting all Muslims, and especially American Muslims, with the same brush that he paints Al-Qaeda, referring to both groups as simply they, and when we have the GOP trust saying things like they attacked us on September 11th and now they want to build a mosque on Ground Zero, it's becoming clear that not only is Islamophobia on the rise, but it is now increasingly mainstream. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we should be concerned about this. But for me, there is something very personal about this, not just as an American Muslim and as a media commentator, but the fact that my entire dissertation was based on the institutionalized Islamophobia in Europe. My conclusion was that although the Islamophobia that is so rampant in Europe, with political parties and politicians basing entire platforms on anti-Islamic sentiment, and how that has created precisely the situation in which we see the rise of radicalization and extremism amongst Muslim youth in Europe, youth who feel marginalized and dispossessed, youth who feel as though their very identity is under attack by their political and religious leaders, that could never happen in the United States. That sure, we would have individuals, and we have had individuals, who would take up the cause of violence and jihad, even though they are American Muslims, but that it would never become a trend here, precisely because of America's historic commitment to religious tolerance, religious freedoms, and religious liberties. I am standing here before you to say that I was wrong, that the exact same kind of institutional Islamophobia, the mainstreaming of religious bigotry that is so prevalent throughout Europe, is now becoming a huge part of the American political landscape. Now, this is a real troubling development for the United States. Because if we are indeed locked in this so-called battle of ideas with Islamic extremism, then the truth is that the greatest weapon in our arsenal are the 6 to 8 million American Muslims who are thoroughly integrated and assimilated into every level of American society. Muslim Americans, a third of whom, of course, are indigenous Muslims, sometimes referred to as African American Muslims, but there are white Muslims out there. A third of them are indigenous Americans, but that means 70% of Muslims have some sort of immigrant background. And as an immigrant community, they represent the very highest levels of education and literacy amongst any immigrant community in the United States. Economically speaking, American Muslims are very wealthy. Indeed, the median income for a Muslim household in the United States is greater than for a non-Muslim household. 60% of American Muslims own their own homes. JWT, a marketing and branding company, recently sent out a report in which they said that the combined disposable income for Muslims in the United States is $170 billion. That's billion with a B. So in a sense, if Muslims anywhere in the Western world should feel more at home, more comfortable, more integrated and assimilated, it's here in the United States. And indeed, for much of the last 50 years, that has been the case. But now it seems that certain politicians, not just Republicans, certainly Harry Reid can be thrown into this, the Senate Majority Leader, certain politicians are using religious bigotry and anti-Islamic sentiment as a political platform, as a way to actually gain votes. And we have an entire news network, Fox News, that has used and whipped up anti-Islamic sentiment as a way to draw viewers to itself. Is America becoming more Islamophobic? Or is it just the case that the Islamophobia that was always there on the margins is now becoming more mainstream? That's our question for today. And for those of you who think that America is becoming more Islamophobic, what does this mean to the so-called war on terror? Are we at risk of becoming like Europe? Are we at risk of creating a new generation of young Muslim Americans who are radicalized by the fact that they feel as though their faith and their identity is under attack? When we have the very President of the United States, a man whose sole function is to enforce the Constitution, hedging on whether Muslims have the same religious liberties as others, well, are we in trouble? That's the question for this week. We look forward to your answers. For Aslan Media, this is Reza Aslan.